Coronavirus Video 2, America's Biggest Secret, Take 7. Okay, this is called America's Biggest Secret, A Brief History of the Atomic Bombs. The top right is, I'm sure you know, that is Albert Einstein. On the left, that is a photo of the Enola Gay flying away from the bomb that it dropped, Little Man, upon Hiroshima. And below that are the two bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy. Those were actually the nicknames of the bombs. One of the bombs imploded. It sucked everything in before it spit it back out. And one of the bombs exploded. Okay, the Manhattan Project. One day before Pearl Harbor, FDR created a secret committee to see if making an atomic bomb was feasible. I believe we talked about this before we left for this break. I gave you actually the Einstein letter to FDR. It was something that he wrote when he was on vacation, of all things. And it got FDR interested in the idea of a bomb. Einstein happened to know a great many of the scientists, not only in Germany, but in other parts of Europe. He was still in contact or connection with a lot of them. They were writing letters back and forth. They were sharing information. And it's possible that without Einstein's letter, FDR might not have acted on this right away, if at all. Einstein himself never did work on any of the bombs, but he was worried about Hitler getting a hold of it. Manhattan became the initial headquarters. And of course, the nickname became the Manhattan Project, which was a great name because anybody who had heard of it thought that Manhattan was building another big skyscraper. But the original meetings did take place there. Now, we know that Germany and Britain and the Soviet Union were also trying to build an atomic bomb. We were sharing secrets with Britain. Winston Churchill and FDR had a great working relationship. In fact, I would say they had a great friendship, and they kept almost no secrets from each other, although there were a few atomic bomb secrets we kept from Britain. But overall, they knew what we were up to. We knew what they were up to. We were not sharing with the Soviets. Joseph Stalin was not all that happy about that. In fact, that's one of the reasons why he distrusted us so much. He knew more about the bombs than we thought, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Take that, Hitler. Many of Robert Oppenheimer's 30-plus scientists were German refugees. Hitler, of course, as you know, was so terrible to Jews, and there were some Jewish scientists who saw the handwriting on the wall, and they were able to get out. They were able to get green cards, somebody like Einstein, for example, and many of them wound up going to the United States. In fact, there was an Italian scientist named Enrico Fermi, and his wife was Jewish. And even though he lived in Italy, he feared what Hitler could or would do with Jews. And he actually got out, and he and his wife went to America as well. Among the scientists, the most famous were Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi, and Niels Bohr. There were three women that worked on the bombs. One of them was named Lily Hornig, and another was named Leona Woods. There was a spy among the scientists, and his name was Klaus Fuchs. Fermi created the first nuclear chain reaction. That was in the year 1942. That basically said or suggested that this could be done. So we say a lot, atomic bomb. An atomic bomb is a nuclear bomb. An atomic bomb is a nuclear bomb. You split the atom, and that's what Fermi was able to do. And when he split the atom in 1942 and created this chain reaction, that was how America knew really for the first time that this was something that was going to be done. But they had to extract a lot of uranium, and that was where the next thing comes in. Well, then, not the next thing, but right after that. Many scientists protested after hearing Germany isn't pregnant. So the man who oversaw the making of the bomb, his name was Robert Oppenheimer, but he was not a military man. He answered to a military man named Leslie Groves. He was a general. Leslie Groves was the man who went into the camp in New Mexico, Alamogordo, New Mexico, where the scientists were working. And he had a code word for them, and he said Germany isn't pregnant. And what that meant was Germany was not in a position to create a bomb. They were many, 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 many years away. They were going about it the wrong way. They were using something called dirty water, which is too complicated to explain, and they were unable to complete it at this moment in time, and they weren't going to be able to for many years. The Canadians actually, some years later, completed the first atomic bomb or nuclear bomb with dirty water. A lot of the scientists, upon hearing that, revolted. A lot of the scientists said, well, then why are we making this bomb? It's so deadly. It's so god-awful. If we know that Germany doesn't have one, maybe we should quit making one. Leslie Groves, under orders of FDR, under orders of George Marshall as well, wasn't going to have that. And he was going to make sure that there was no revolt of any kind whatsoever, and that every single one of those scientists stayed on the job. But there was a lot of tension. There were a lot of people there who did not want for that. Even Oppenheimer himself, that's a picture of him, the man with the cigarette there. He himself had a really difficult time keeping the scientists in line. And he himself started to change his opinion on whether or not he wanted to complete this. Oppenheimer was not the brightest of the scientists. Most of the scientists who worked under him were actually smarter than him. Where his talent lay was he was a great manager of these tremendous personalities, right? It's like a baseball team or a basketball team with a bunch of superstars, right? And you need a manager to keep them in line. And the manager oftentimes was a player when he was younger, and he wasn't oftentimes as good as the players he's managing or coaching. And that's exactly what Oppenheimer was. Okay, there were 120,000 workers. Forgive me here. This is sensitive, this Chromebook. There were 120,000 workers in Washington State, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and in New Mexico, not terribly far from where the scientists were working. And of those workers, well over 99.9% were completely oblivious as to what it was that they were working on. They were on what's called a need-to-know basis. So the managers knew more than the workers, and the managers of the managers knew more than the managers who knew more than the workers, and so on and so forth. But almost everybody who was working on this project really had no idea what they were working on. They suspected it was some kind of a weapon, but they, honest to God, had no idea. So if you went into some of those camps, if you went into Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which was mostly female workers, you would see signs there. One of them said, what you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. These were the billboards as soon as you drove into the facility, and they lived on the facility, most of them. Another one was your pen and tongue can be enemy weapons. There were other signs that said something about loose lips help Hitler sink ships or something to that effect. So everything was kept in utter secrecy, and people who work there, people who live there, their phone calls were monitored, their mail was screened, and so on and so forth. If they knew too much and the government found out they knew too much, they were immediately taken from the project. This really was the greatest secret. Now, I mentioned before a man named Klaus Fuchs. Now, Fuchs actually was a Soviet spy, if you can believe that. And I've always found that not only fascinating, but amazing that among all these scientists and among all this secrecy, among all these safety measures, that you were actually able to somehow, some way, get a spy in there. And that spy was Klaus Fuchs. He was working secretly for Joseph Stalin. And after the project was over, shortly after the project was over, he left the scientists. He gave information to a man by the last name of Glass, who then gave that information to his sister, and her name was Ethel Rosenberg. And the Rosenbergs were actually caught, and the Rosenbergs were executed for this. They seemed like they were average, everyday next-door neighbors, and they were executed for their involvement in this. I forget what happened to Glass. I honest to God forget what happened to Glass. I think he escaped, and Fuchs escaped and got over to the Soviet Union where he was protected. And Stalin knew a lot more about what was going on than we ever knew. And that's the biggest reason why the Soviets were able to come up with their own super weapon in 1949. And that shocked the heck out of us. We did not see that coming. Deserts of New Mexico became the testing site. The first test bomb was dropped from what looked like a giant oil rig onto the ground. People within approximately 100 miles in all directions were evacuated. They were told there was some sort of a disease and the area was being quarantined. And before the bomb actually was dropped, Enrico Fermi bet one of his fellow scientists that they would actually destroy the entire state of New Mexico. And it was obviously kind of like facetious. It was sort of like a funny bet, if you will, although it doesn't sound that funny to me. And he was wrong, but it did do an unbelievable amount of damage. And by July of 45, the scientists, and therefore the United States government, and therefore FDR, they knew, not FDR, Truman, they knew what they had at that moment in time. FDR had passed in April of 45, and within 24 hours of taking the presidency, Harry Truman, who had only been vice president for 6 weeks, he was told by some people in the cabinet of FDR, who now was Truman's cabinet, they called him into a secret meeting, and they said to him, "Listen, we have a little bit of information for you." And the information was, we will soon have workable atomic bombs. And I'm not sure how Truman took that information. There's a great story that goes with that. Eleanor Roosevelt was at her husband's funeral, and Truman showed up at the funeral, and Truman did the right thing, and he walked up to Eleanor, and he said to her, "Please, if there's anything that I can do for you and your family at this time of need, let me know." And then Eleanor got off the great line, "Oh no, Mr. President, if there's anything that you need, you let me know, for you are the one who's in trouble now." And it suggests that Eleanor may have known about the bombs. Almost nobody did. I doubt there were more than 24 people who knew about the bombs. I know that MacArthur knew, because it became MacArthur's job to pull the troops out of the Pacific Theater of War so that they would not be affected by this when it was dropped upon Japan. But as you know, the bombs originally were not supposed to be dropped upon Japan. They were supposed to be used against Germany. Germany surrendered the war in 1945, and so you didn't have to use the bombs for them. But Japan was stubborn, and Japan would not surrender the war. That was not a part of their culture, right? The kamikaze culture. It was worse to live and go back, right, than it was to die for your nation. You would be a social outcast, and your family would be socially eliminated from everything. So that was the way the Japanese mindset was. They would not surrender. And when a committee got together with Truman to discuss, should we drop the bombs or not, that was one of the things that came up in that meeting, was the Japanese will not surrender. Fat Man and Little Boy were ready by July of 45. And there were some questions that remain. I'll show you that in a moment. Oppenheimer himself was such a nervous wreck over all of this that he lost some 70 pounds. He was kind of skinny to begin with. Forgive me here. He was kind of skinny to begin with. He probably was 6'2", 6'3", weighed about 180 pounds, so he was lanky. He was a chain smoker. They say he was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and he wasn't eating. And he got down to something like 110 pounds. He looked like a skeleton. That's how nervous he was over all of this. So there's the part about Truman learning FDR's secret in April. And now here are the 3 big questions that remain as Japan simply refused to surrender. 1, what is the rationale for dropping the bomb? Can you do that? Can you do that upon innocent civilians? And are the Japanese civilians even innocent to begin with? A lot of them were helping out the war effort in various ways. So these were things that they had to consider. Perhaps the biggest thing that they considered was how many American lives they would save by using these bombs over Japan, because it was deemed that the only way to get Japan to quit the war would be to launch a ground strike into Tokyo and some of their other major cities and destroy their military installations. And there were studies, and the studies suggested that perhaps as many as 50,000, maybe even 100,000 American soldiers would lose their lives. So if you drop the bombs, none of them lose their lives. They also had to consider prisoners of war, and they had to drop the bombs, that's number 2, in places where you wouldn't harm them. And they wanted to drop the bombs in places that were sizable, but not too sizable. In other words, they wanted to make an impression. They wanted to prove what it was that they had. They wanted to show Japan that they had no choice but to surrender, but they didn't want to kill 10 million people in Tokyo. So they chose these mid-level size cities, cities I would say that would be like the size of Albany or Syracuse, but not so small that Japan wouldn't quite recognize how serious the matter was. So they drew up a list of approximately a half a dozen cities, and on the list was Hiroshima, and on the list was Nagasaki, and on the list actually was another city. And on the second dropping, Paul Tibbets was the pilot, and the name of his plane was Boxcar, B-O-C-K''S, Boxcar. And he was going to drop the bomb on the other city, and he didn't like the weather. He didn't like that he didn't have clear visibility. It was a little bit cloudy there. So he went to the next site. He went to the very next target on his list, which was Nagasaki. So if you could imagine that, right? The difference between life and death was a little bit of a cloudiness in the sky, and it altered Tibbets' plan. Tibbets was one of two men who were chosen to fly it. Okay, and that's Charles Sweeney was the pilot who flew Boxcar. I'm sorry, I said Tibbets. Tibbets was the pilot who flew the first plane, and it was named the Enola Gay, and that was named after his mother. That was her full name before she married Mr. Tibbets. And he was selected. A small list of names was drawn up by a small committee of pilots they thought they would have the nerve to do this. B, they wouldn't feel shame or guilt over having done it. This wouldn't affect them for the rest of their lives. And C, they could keep a secret. And Tibbets was on that list, and Sweeney was on that list. Tibbets, it's interesting, he lived to be about 100 years old, and there were many books written about him. I have a book about him called Duty, and in that book, he talks about how for the rest of his life, he never felt any kind of guilt whatsoever. In fact, he was proud to do it because he saved all those American lives. As a little side note, here's some pictures of what happened over Japan. As a little side note, the USS Indianapolis was the ship, the Navy ship, that brought the plane from point A to point B. And they brought the bombs, from point A to point B. And that it was so secretive that the only person on the entire ship who knew about it was the captain himself. The men knew they were delivering some kind of goods, but they had no idea they were delivering atomic bombs. And a Japanese torpedo sank the ship after it landed at its intended point, which was Tiananmen Island. And when the ship went down, fortunately, there were no atomic bombs in it. Those things had already been delivered. But when the ship went down, I think something like 400 died immediately. But then another several hundred died over the coming days when they were stranded in the water for 4 straight days. And the sharks and the barracudas were picking them off one by one. They talk about it in the movie Jaws. There's a scene actually at night when they're on the ship, and Quint, who's the one of the 3 main characters, he's the steely-eyed guy, the fisherman. He talks about that. He talks about being on that ship, and of course he's a fictional character, but everything he says in that scene is real. So many men died, and there was no SOS. There was no distress call because it was so secretive. They were not allowed to give any kind of a distress call. So people didn't know that they were missing for days, and many lost their lives. I think there were 388 survivors in total, and to this day, there's a handful left, and they still meet every single year as like an anniversary get-together. But every year it gets smaller, it dwindles. Okay, so that pretty much wraps it up for today, and I'll give you another one of these videos shortly. I hope you got something out of this. I hope you're all being safe in this time of the coronavirus. Okay, practice safe social distancing. And I miss you guys. All right, bye.